All right, we just got the big reveal from Baldur's Gate 3 during the PaxEAST press conference, which is the first gameplay reveal of Baldur's Gate 3. And I think that there's been a bit of a divide in the fan base of both Baldur's Gate and D&D digital games along the lines of Divinity, Original Sin, so on and so forth. So today I want to kind of explore real quick what that live stream really kind of hinted at, what it showed, and really what my thoughts are. I think that a lot of people that grew up playing the Baldur's Gate series, and that extends from Baldur's Gate 1, 2, Planescape, Neverwinter Nights 1 and 2, Icewind Dale 1 and 2. So you have an entire franchise based off of the Infinity engine, the old engine that Baldur's Gate used, that really kind of shaped Dungeons & Dragons digital games, and at the same time shaped that kind of early, I guess you could say, gold standard for RPG games to come. And then they went on to further influence stuff like Pillars of Eternity with its open combat, its non-pausable, non-turn, real-time combat system, which is very similar, again, to the entire Baldur's Gate series, Icewind Dale, Neverwinter Nights, so on and so forth. You do have the ability to pause in those games, but it is not a turn-style system. Kind of a fake real time, but also went on to obviously influence stuff like Knights of the Old Republic 1 and 2. But talking back about this live stream, we saw the cinematic opening of the game, right? We got to see the Mind Flayer doing his little destructive action and how that will play a really big part of the Baldur's Gate 3 storyline. And then we jumped into character creation. So the title of this video obviously is Baldur's Gate 3 ? Or Divinity Original Sin 3 ? And I think that's where the big divide is. Is this a Baldur's Gate game? Or is this a Divinity Original Sin game with the Baldur's Gate name attached to it? And I think it's really not a fair comparison. When you're taking a look at these two franchises, Divinity Original Sin does a lot of things. And they do a lot of things very well. And I think Larian Studios looked at that and said, hey, what do they do very well? Or what do we do very well? And combat system is a big part of that. Character creation is a big part of that. And I think that's why when we take a look at this Baldur's Gate 3 character creation menu, we're not only just seeing a system that is very similar to Divinity Original Sin, we're seeing buttons that are pretty much directly out of Divinity Original Sin. And I think that that button usage right now is just because of the current stage of development of the game. I'm sure that those will kind of get rebranded or changed around to feel true to just a Baldur's Gate on its own game versus like I guess the engine base of Divinity Original Sin. But as we kind of progress through the character creation screen, we're dealt another little cinematic as we jump into the game full bore. And this is where we get to really see the game in its entirety. And it has a lot of other RPGs that kind of pour into it. You can see that kind of Dragon Age Origins seeping into just the presentation style of the game. Even the way you move around the map kind of feels like a throwback to Neverwinter Nights 2 with a semi-close third-person view. It's not that isometric top-down view that you get when you, say, play Pillars of Eternity, or even Divinity Original Sin, which has a camera that is a little bit further away, I feel. And then as we jump into the actual dialogue, we get something that is a lot more RPG presentation cinematic. It's very Skyrim-esque or Dragon Age Origins-esque, where we're zooming into the characters, we're seeing them talk, we're seeing their vocal inflections reflecting their actual physical attributes, the way they're looking around and everything. So we're getting this very narrative-heavy RPG, much in the same way that Baldur's Gate was. Baldur's Gate is so much more about the story than it is the combat system. And I think a lot of people are getting hung up on that combat system, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. But as you kind of move through this live stream, it shows them displaying the way the dialogue system works. And one thing that's really worth noting about the dialogue system is the way that they deal with dilemmas and the roles in the middle of the dialogue system. Now, for those of you who have played Disco Elysium, which is a new isometric kind of murder mystery take and spin on the RPG system, you'll see a dialogue system that kind of borrows from Disco Elysium. And for those of you who don't know, Disco Elysium actually had Larian Studios come in and consult and help them out for their dialogue system. So you see this really cool trading of ideas. Disco Elysium is arguably one of the best RPGs to come out in all of 2019. And it's very interesting to see that Baldur's Gate is taking that kind of dialogue system, which gives you a bit of a carrot, right? And anytime you have a conversation in Disco Elysium and you fail the roll, you don't feel like you missed out on something in the game because the conversation doesn't just stop dead. It just opens up a new door and a new path. And I like that so much about Disco Elysium, and it looks like we're getting that with Baldur's Gate 3. You know, we see the physical die being rolled on screen. You can then see, okay, this rolled, it failed, and then the conversation progresses like you failed, and not as if that the conversation just stopped dead because you couldn't make that roll and you should probably come back when you have more charisma. Like, it actually kind of feels fluid, and it feels like you're having a real live conversation, because I know anytime I fail my charisma roll, it just is fucking miserable. But I don't want to talk about going home alone. I want to talk about Baldur's Gate 3. So progressing then from the dialogue system, we should move now into the combat system. And now again, I think this is the most controversial portion of the Baldur's Gate 3 gameplay reveal. And I'm not going to lie to you, when I first saw it, I was like, God damn it. This isn't cool. I don't like this. I don't like this. This is not Baldur's Gate. It's not real time. It's not that top-down view that I have kind of grown to love. But then I remember my most recent playthroughs of Baldur's Gate 3, and I've kind of thought to myself, like, man, this is very hectic. It's hard, and I find myself pausing all the time anyway. Even when I play Pillars of Eternity, I find myself doing the action, pressing pause, waiting for the next action to queue up, go, pause, go, pause. So I'm basically playing turn-based in a real-time world, and it is very clunky. I think for a lot of people, when Pillars of Eternity introduced its turn-based, they never looked back. And when I think about Divinity Original Sin 2 as well, I think of a game that was extremely enjoyable, and the combat system of Divinity Original Sin, it really pays homage to the roots of Dungeons & Dragons. And Baldur's Gate 3 is not a Larian Studios creation that loosely is based off of Dungeons & Dragons. This is a Dungeons & Dragons game. That's what Baldur's Gate 3 is going to be about. So I think that this kind of approach of taking a more true to the tabletop approach for the combat system, I think it works well, and I think it works better than a live action, or I'm sorry, a real time would have. We get some cinematic shots, much in the same vein as like an XCOM shot where you're zooming in and it kills the alien you're attacking. You get that kind of really cool, visceral and cinematic feel. But I think that as a whole, this plays better with the current state of games. You think about how Dungeons & Dragons is such a huge part of the gaming community now. I mean, I think that it's become so much more mainstream than it was even 10 years ago. Now everyone has a D&D group. Everyone watches Matt Mercer and his crew blunder through everything as the Mighty Nine. So I think that this whole kind of take on the true to form tabletop is what Baldur's Gate probably needed in a 21st century Baldur's Gate. I mean, this isn't the olden days where they kind of had to make this work for people and be accessible. I mean, I couldn't imagine playing a Dungeons & Dragons 3.5 RPG game that was turn-based and you had to use every little just mind-boggling thing that they had to deal with, right? Like Thaco and all that kind of action was so much more cumbersome in 3.5. With 5th edition D&D, you get a much more fluid and interesting combat system. And that is introduced in Baldur's Gate 3. You have a lot of the Z-axis to play with, much more than you ever had in Divinity Original Sin 2 or 1. You can be up on the rafters above a church, shooting down with a bow and arrow. You can be up on these large overpasses, shooting into things. And then you can actually even knock people off over ledges. It kind of shows in the live stream how the guy uses a mage hand to smack a little tiny brain demon off of a ledge, and he shoots far away. And it's really cool. It kind of adds this dynamicism to the game and makes it a lot more fun and free-flowing. So even though it is a turn-based combat system, you have so much of the Z-axis to play with that it does feel like you have a lot of influence over the environment in a way that is very Larian Studios, but also in a way that is very Dungeons & Dragons. And I think it's a very fun kind of change to pace of things. The last thing I do want to talk about here, I think that is another big point of contention, or at least a big bring up for a lot of people, is the art direction, the display of things. You get this when you kind of talk about stuff compared from Baldur's Gate 2 to what we see with 3. Diablo 3 with compared to Diablo 2. This kind of watered down, more colorful color palette and less of a grayscale, a brighter world versus the darker world of the yesteryear for both of those series or franchises. And I think it's worth noting that, yeah, sure, this might be a visually brighter seeming game, but the storyline is a little bit more serious. It doesn't seem as boisterous and fun and kind of I guess haphazard as Divinity Original Sin kind of does. There's too many times in Divinity Original Sin where I never really felt that there were real stakes. In this, it kind of starts you off with right in the middle of the action. Things are going down fast, and it's got a little bit more of a darker tone to the story itself. The actual visuals, I think, are just indicative of the way it would seem in a fantastical world. I mean, I think it's pretty easy to say like, oh, you know, this doesn't have the same color palette that I want. I wanted a darker, more gothic color palette. But I think that the color palette doesn't matter if the story is on point to kind of match that overall mood. Now, we don't really know a whole ton about the story just yet. We've just seen bits and pieces. Even the kind of splunking through the caves was a pretty bright portrayal of those caves. But I'm sure that there's going to be portions of the game that are pretty grim and pretty terrifying. I mean, Baldur's Gate 2, when you think about it, the opening portions of the game they're very, very intense, and you have main characters being killed off in the first 2 minutes. And as the game progresses through the opening dungeon and then into the opening portion, the first town, it kind of lightens up a little bit. But then you're kind of given these nightmares that kind of bring you back and forth, like, oh, yeah, this is definitely still a dark world. And again, I think that's more of a symptom of the times. It was easier to tell a story that was that grim and that dark back then compared to now, where you have to cater to a wider audience, in my opinion. That's just strictly me, the presenter, saying this. So it might not be Larian's approach, so we'll see in times to come how they take things. But I think that to appeal to a wider audience that isn't strictly the tabletop audience, but also appeal to the digital audience, I think Baldur's Gate 3 kind of hits the mark. I think it took me some time to warm up to it, and it took me actually watching the entire hour-and-a-half stream. Well, it's actually an hour. The first half hour is just kind of preamble. But at the end of the stream, I kind of thought to myself, okay, this is it. This is going to be good. I'm actually excited about this. I like the dialogue system. I like the kind of very personal approach to seeing the characters firsthand as they speak. It did kind of take me out of it a little bit that I now have a voice acted protagonist. That is a little interesting, but at the same time, I really feel that when games do that, it tends to be a little bit more fun and inviting, and it's easier to kind of sink into the game because you have someone voice acting your role more or less for you. So I'm all for it. It did take me some time again to warm up to it, but I think that what we're going to get with Baldur's Gate 3 is going to be very true to the overall feel of Baldur's Gate, but with just that twist that Larian Studios does so well. I mean, they've released nothing but great games, and I think that it's worth kind of tipping the hat to them when it comes to them taking a beloved franchise, which a lot of these guys from the development team were saying like, hey, these were some of the first games I've ever wanted to work on, or I was working on a game at the same time as it came out, and I was so jealous I was not on that game. So this is not just some like scary like AAA publisher going like, well, how can we bastardize this and make money? It's a company of people that do love this series, and they grew up with it just in the same way we did, and it's them kind of giving their own spin on it. And I'm excited to see where it goes as early access hits later this year. We'll definitely be playing this on the channel. Baldur's Gate was a huge part of my upbringing, so I will absolutely be playing this when it does come out. But I'd love to hear your opinions, guys. Keep in mind, I know some of you are going to be very negative on this. I know some of you are going to be very positive on this. But I think it's worth remembering that A, this is not the final product, and they're going to take what we say about these things into consideration. I don't think it's going to drastically change the game, but it is worth noting that saying how you feel about a game will eventually kind of reach the ears of the developers. They do watch these things in some way, shape, or form. Not my videos. I just mean the community as a whole. So go ahead and let me know in the comment section below how you feel about Baldur's Gate 3. Again, it took me some warming up, but I'm finally on board with it, and I'm really excited to see how this progresses in the months to come. But as always, thank you so much for watching here today. Have a good one and take care.